Final Fantasy XIV is the first Final Fantasy game I've ever played, so this isn't even really just the first, 2 months of Final Fantasy XIV, but also the first 2 months of the Final Fantasy franchise in general for me. I know each game is kind of like its own entity, and they're not really that connected, but I just wanted to point that out anyway. Now, I plan on making an entire video talking about why I switched from WoW to FF14, but for the sake of giving context to this video, I wanted to add a super broad and quick bit of information about why I decided to switch. I had been playing WoW for a good bit and enjoyed the first patch of Shadowlands a decent amount in the beginning, and was starting to get into Classic WoW as I tried out FF14. Ultimately, it was pretty simple, to be honest. It really just came down to Blizzard being a bad company, ignoring the community feedback, not being transparent with the community, and making poor design decisions that made WoW feel like a chore to play. Those, variety of reasons are ultimately what led me to decide to try out Final Fantasy XIV. The leveling experience in Final Fantasy XIV is weird. I don't dislike it, but at the same time, I don't really like it all that much either. Now, I should clarify that I'm talking about the first time leveling experience here, meaning first job on your first character. Leveling up jobs after you, first hit 80 makes sense to me. Do the duty roulettes for the daily bonus, fates if you're one of those people. The Boston Southern Front is decent from 71 to 80. If you want to grind out levels, then you do the highest level dungeon you have unlocked. That all makes sense to me and is perfectly fine. When you're talking about over a dozen jobs on one character, it's bound to be repetitive. I totally get that. It's the initial leveling experience where you go through the main story quest that is very polarizing for me. Everything is alright in the beginning, standard, typical stuff, everything's fine. Introduced to some characters, taken some sites to establish an understanding of the new fantasy world you've entered for the first time. Go through the basic tutorials, since game companies have to assume you don't understand how to move or turn, and begin to go through the tutorial quest explaining how an MMO works. Boring, trivial, but necessary, all fine and good. Then you head through your main story quest from 15 to 50. Level 15, you start doing dungeons, which are extremely tedious, but designed to be entry level, so again, perfectly fine. The A Realm Reborn story is kind of trash, to be completely honest with you. It drags on for so long, and I never really cared at all. I started to skip some of the quest texts at around level 30-ish, because I just couldn't bring myself to care. With all that said, it's fine. You go through and you hit level 50, woo. Time to move on to Heavensward, right? No. Not at all. In fact, I'm partially convinced there's an employee at Square Enix whose entire job is to just sit there and laugh at new players who hit level 50 and talk about how excited they are to start Heavensward. You gotta play through every single level 50 A Realm Reborn patch content quest. Every single one. You go through the leveling experience, progressing your character at a normal, reasonable pace, and then just hit a brick wall and are stuck at level 50 for what feels like forever. And the same thing happens after you finish Heavensward at 60, and again after Stormblood at 70. While I haven't read a ton about Endwalker because I want to be surprised, I'm going to assume the same thing will happen at level 80 once Endwalker comes out. It's just so weird to me. Why is it like that? I get that the story continues through it all and the patch content sets up the leveling content of the next expansion, but it's just so much. You just stop. Everything is going fine and then just stops. It really feels like Square Enix has failed to adjust the leveling experience in a way that makes it more fluid. Rather than releasing expansions and refitting the older content to more streamline the experience of getting to the newer content, it seems like they just add the newer stuff into the game without considering what the leveling experience of new players looks like. Overall, my leveling experience was fine. I don't really know what way to add on to it other than it was fine. I really enjoyed Heavensward and Shadowbringers. Didn't really like Stormblood and A Realm Reborn too much. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give my first leveling experience with Final Fantasy XIV a 7. The way it just comes to a halt at each of the max levels for the patch content really just bogs down the experience for me. Overall, it's fine. The stories for each expansion are pretty good, and you spend so much time with the core cast of characters like Alphinaud, Alisaie, and Y'shtola that you get fairly attached and invested in what happens. Overall, it's fine. The profession jobs in this game are really cool, honestly. I haven't played around with all of them, but I have begun leveling a few. I've messed around a little with fishing, botany, culinarian, leatherworking, and carpentry. FF14guild.com has been a great resource for learning how the jobs work and the best ways to level them up, because it can be a tad bit overwhelming going in blind as a brand new player. It's really cool how they have unique abilities specific to them. I like how there's a real sort of animation that goes with it as well. It's not just you fiddling your thumbs for however long and then the thing shows up in your inventory. Crafting feels more substantial and meaningful, even if you're just crafting worthless stuff to just level up. Fishing has been pretty cool so far as well. I liked fishing in WoW a lot, to be honest, because it was very peaceful. Extremely boring, but peaceful. In WoW, you just press the cast button and then click the bobber when the audio and visual cue happens. Of course, Final Fantasy XIV is basically that as well, but you at least have different abilities that can make it easier to catch better fish, high quality fish. There's different bait that actually matters, and it just feels more involved. The Disciple of the Hand and the Disciple of the Land jobs feel more like an actual activity to do, rather than just a boring chore of a gameplay system like they are in WoW. It was also really nice to see that Square Enix expanded upon professions as a system and made them feel a little bit more substantial. Definitely one of my favorite aspects of the game so far, and I look forward to getting some of them to max level at some point in the future. This is where things get a little strange. I like a lot of the dungeons in this game, I really do, but some of them are just insanely easy. Even the hard modes I've done, which, to be fair, have only been the ARR hard modes, have been super easy. A lot of the dungeons in this game seem almost impossible to wipe on, unless you're actively trying to wipe. Toward the end of my time with WoW, I started to get more and more into Mythic Plus, and I wish that Final Fantasy XIV had some sort of real endgame progression system with truly difficult and challenging dungeon gameplay. A lot of the dungeons are interesting and they're aesthetic, and a good bit of them have some intriguing fights as well, but overall they're just kind of underwhelming. The boss fights tend to be hit or miss, which is fine. Obviously not everything's going to be a banger. Most of the trash mobs have no means of killing you. You can't die. I know I'm not bad at the game, but I'm not extremely good either, and I rarely have trouble keeping us alive during pulls. It's almost impossible for tanks to lose aggro, and I haven't played a DPS enough to know if any of the rotations are difficult, so I won't comment on that. I will say that in a lot of my groups, trash mobs get deleted very quickly. Overall, I've enjoyed the majority of the dungeons, but it was super underwhelming once it got closer and closer to 80, and they never got difficult. Again, like I've said, I haven't read or watched anything about Endwalker, and I probably won't, because I want to be surprised. So they absolutely could have mentioned expanding upon dungeons with Endwalker. If they have, feel free to let me know in the comments below. The couple of months I've spent playing Final Fantasy XIV have been awesome. There are a few things about it that are super annoying, but the positives by far outweigh the negatives. There are other topics that I want to talk about, like raids, trials, and the acquisition of relic weapons, but as I was writing the script for this video, I realized just how much there is that I want to talk about. I don't want it to all be overwhelming and a bunch of information and opinions thrown in your faces all at once, so I'm going to break this up into a few parts. This has been part 1 of a new player's experience with Final Fantasy XIV. Thank you for watching, and I hope you come back for part 2.